By the middle of 1943, the war in the Pacific had reached its critical point. After a series of devastating defeats, Japan was losing control over its vast island territories. American forces were advancing step by step, cutting off garrisons from supply routes and naval support. One such outpost was a small atoll in the southern part of the Solomon Islands, a remote strip of land where a group of Japanese soldiers found themselves isolated, surrounded, and left to survive on dwindling rations and fading orders. Since late May 1943, the garrison had been under blockade. Enemy ships patrolled the surrounding waters, while reconnaissance planes circled above. Every attempt to break through the encirclement ended in failure. By mid-June, the defenders were exhausted. Ammunition was nearly gone, food supplies were critical, and the only remaining drinking water came from makeshift rain collectors. Disease spread quickly in the tropical heat. Still, no order to surrender came. For these men, capture was the ultimate disgrace, a fate worse than death. Years of military indoctrination had convinced them that the enemy was merciless and that any soldier taken alive would be tortured or executed. To surrender meant to lose one's honor and one's identity. And so, when the American bombardment began on the morning of the 15th of June, 1943, many of the soldiers prepared themselves to die. The artillery barrage was relentless. Explosions shook the earth and filled the air with sand and smoke. By noon, resistance had collapsed. A few dozen men, led by their remaining officer, gathered near the ruins of their bunker. With no ammunition left and nowhere to retreat, they made the decision to lay down their weapons. Under the scorching sun, around 50 Japanese soldiers stepped onto the beach, unarmed and silent. They expected death. The Americans, advancing cautiously, ordered them to sit on the sand. The prisoners lowered their heads, refusing to look at their captors, but the violence they feared never came. Instead of beatings or humiliation, they encountered order and discipline. They were given water, their wounds were dressed, and they were moved to a holding area under guard. Confusion spread among them. How could the enemy, portrayed for years as barbaric, behave this way? Throughout that day, American medical officers examined each prisoner. They recorded names, checked wounds, and provided treatment. Medics cleaned burns, bandaged arms, and distributed tablets against dysentery and fever. The prisoners watched in disbelief. For them, it made no sense. Why would an enemy waste medicine on captives? Some resisted treatment, suspecting poison or interrogation tricks. But the reality was simple. The doctors were following protocol. By evening, the prisoners were loaded onto a transport ship heading for a rear base. The voyage took several days. In the ship's hold, the men sat in silence, eating from tin rations and sleeping on the floor. The monotony of the engines and the distant sound of waves filled the nights. No one knew where they were going. Some expected a labor camp, others execution. Every creak of the hull made hearts tighten with fear. And yet, the guards remained calm, professional, and indifferent. It was the first time the prisoners began to sense that the war outside might follow rules they had never imagined. When the ship finally reached its destination, the prisoners were brought ashore under bright tropical sun. Before them stood a fenced compound, the camp. Wooden towers marked the perimeter, but the place looked strangely orderly. Inside, neat rows of barracks lined well-swept paths. Soldiers with rifles stood watch, yet their demeanor was measured, almost routine. The prisoners were registered one by one, given numbers, and assigned sleeping quarters. Inside each barrack were wooden bunks, blankets, and wash basins. For men accustomed to muddy trenches and caves, this was almost incomprehensible. The first days passed in tension. Nobody spoke much. Food was distributed 3 times a day: rice, vegetables, meat or fish, bread, and hot tea. The quality astonished them. Many refused to eat at first, convinced that the meals were a trick. But when nothing happened, hesitation gave way to quiet acceptance. In the evenings, the guards allowed them short walks in the yard, For the first time in months, they felt the ocean breeze without fearing gunfire. The camp administration followed the Geneva Convention meticulously. Each prisoner received an identification card and was informed of his rights. They were told that they were under international protection and would remain safe until the war's end. Few fully understood what that meant, but the tone was clear: they were not being treated as criminals. This fact alone began to shift something deep within them. Within weeks, camp life developed a rhythm. Every morning there was roll call, followed by breakfast and assigned duties. Some men repaired fences or carried supplies. Others cleaned the grounds or maintained equipment. None of it was backbreaking work. The purpose was to maintain order and morale. In exchange, they received small coupons that could be exchanged for tobacco, extra food, or paper for writing letters. The camp's medical section worked efficiently. The sick were treated daily. Those suffering from malaria were transferred to an isolation ward with proper beds and ventilation. To men who had been living in swamps and trenches, it felt surreal. Even more surprising, a few of the camp's doctors encouraged Japanese prisoners with medical training to assist in the infirmary, not as servants, but as aides. As time passed, the fear of sudden violence faded. The camp became a strange, self-contained world, a fragment of stability amid global chaos. A library opened with books in both English and Japanese. Sports fields were built. Evenings were quiet. Some prisoners wrote journals. Others sketched or simply sat outside, listening to the hum of insects. For men who had expected to die, the simplicity of routine became an unexpected form of relief. Still, not all wounds were physical. Many were haunted by shame, the sense of having failed their country, their families, and their own code of honor. To them, the comfort of the camp felt undeserved. Yet slowly, through repetition and structure, a fragile acceptance emerged. The enemy's humanity, once denied, became impossible to ignore. By August 1943, the camp functioned with machine-like efficiency. Morning inspections, chores, meals, lights out, everything followed schedule. But beneath this order lay something deeper, a quiet transformation. Fear had given way to observation. Suspicion had begun to dissolve into cautious respect. Reports filed by American officers from that period described the prisoners as disciplined, reserved, cooperative. The documents, written in plain language, captured something profound that men who had expected brutality found instead a measured, almost bureaucratic kindness. For the prisoners, this was the beginning of a new understanding. War, they began to realize, was not only a struggle of armies, but also a test of principles. And here, behind the fences of a tropical camp, they were learning that even in captivity, humanity could survive. By early September 1943, life inside the prisoner of war camp had settled into a steady rhythm. For the men who had survived the chaos of the Pacific Front, this order felt almost unreal. Each day followed the same pattern: wake up at dawn, roll call, breakfast, work assignments, lunch, rest, and lights out. The monotony was both a burden and a form of healing. After months of fear and hunger, predictability became a strange kind of comfort. The barracks were simple wooden buildings, long, clean, and divided into rows of bunks. Each man had a blanket, a pillow, and a small wooden locker for personal items. Cleanliness was enforced strictly, but without humiliation. Prisoners were assigned daily duties to keep the camp in order: sweeping, laundry, and maintenance. The guards watched but rarely interfered. Responsibility for discipline rested largely with the prisoners themselves, and this gave them a quiet sense of dignity. Every morning, the prisoners assembled on the parade ground for inspection. The American officers walked slowly down the lines, checking attendance and issuing work details. Afterward, the columns dispersed to various tasks. Some repaired fences or buildings, others tended to vegetable gardens where they grew food for the camp kitchen. Work was organized more for structure than productivity. The goal was not punishment, but occupation to keep minds and hands from idleness. At noon came the meal break. The menu rarely changed. Rice, soup, a small portion of meat or fish, vegetables, and sometimes fruit or bread. It was simple, yet far better than what most had eaten during the final months of battle. For men who had faced starvation, this food represented a return to normal life. Medical care was also carefully maintained. The camp infirmary, staffed by American doctors and medics, operated with military precision. Patients suffering from tropical diseases were quarantined in separate wards, receiving regular treatment. Over time, trust began to grow. At first, prisoners avoided the infirmary, fearing hidden motives. But as men recovered and returned to work, suspicion faded. A former medical student among the prisoners began assisting the staff, translating and helping his comrades. His quiet professionalism impressed both sides and was later documented in Red Cross reports. The first weeks behind the fence were marked by apathy. The soldiers, stripped of rank and purpose, lived in silence. Some sat motionless for hours, staring at the horizon as if waiting for orders that would never come. The shock of captivity had numbed them. Gradually, however, life's small routines, washing, working, eating, writing, began to restore a sense of being. A few started keeping journals, recording details of camp life and reflections about war. The American administration, seeing the therapeutic effect of writing, quietly allowed it. In October 1943, a small library opened inside one of the barracks. It contained books in English and Japanese, novels, history texts, even newspapers from the mainland. Reading became an escape from the sameness of days. Men exchanged books, copied passages, and sometimes used them to study English. Occasionally, the guards projected short documentary films, wartime newsreels, or educational reels. For many, it was the first glimpse of the outside world since their capture. These films were heavily censored, but they revealed something essential. The war was far bigger than their isolated island battle. Work also became a psychological anchor. It gave shape to time and purpose to existence. The prisoners' discipline and skill impressed their captors. Those with mechanical training repaired tools and engines. Others built tables, benches, and storage sheds. The camp gradually evolved from a place of confinement into a small, self-sufficient settlement. Some prisoners began assisting in administrative work, recording supplies, translating reports, or teaching basic language skills to others. Within the fence, a micro-society was forming. The camp was isolated from the world, yet not entirely disconnected. From time to time, new groups of prisoners arrived, survivors from other islands. With them came news, rumors, and fragments of stories about distant battles. Word spread of other camps, some larger, some harsher, and others surprisingly well run. These stories seemed almost mythical, but they strengthened the realization that the enemy's treatment was not governed by hatred, but by discipline and law. In November, the American officers introduced a new system of internal organization. Prisoners elected representatives leaders for each barrack who met with the guards weekly to discuss needs and problems. The idea, borrowed from Red Cross guidelines, reduced tension and encouraged cooperation. The elected men took their role seriously. They negotiated work hours, requested medical supplies, and organized cleaning schedules. For men raised in rigid military hierarchies, where obedience had always been absolute, this limited self-governance was an unfamiliar but empowering experience. Gradually, life within the camp became more human. A small kiosk opened, where prisoners could exchange coupons for paper, tobacco, or small luxuries. Once a month, they were permitted to write a single letter home, 2 pages, censored but real. When the first replies arrived months later, the camp changed. Laughter returned, cautious but sincere. The letters reminded everyone that life existed beyond the fence, that they were not forgotten. Inside the camp, old ranks began to dissolve. Officers and privates worked side by side. War had erased distinctions of class and status. Now there were only men sharing the same rations, the same beds, and the same uncertain future. This equality, unfamiliar and fragile, fostered quiet solidarity. Escape attempts were rare. The prisoners understood that the ocean, the jungle, and the foreign language made freedom impossible. The guards knew it too. Security was maintained, but without cruelty. Barbed wire remained a boundary, not a threat. By the end of 1943, the camp had achieved a delicate balance. Reports described it as stable, orderly, and cooperative. The men had adjusted. Their bodies healed, and so did parts of their minds. Though they remained prisoners, they no longer lived in constant fear. They were learning that survival could exist without humiliation. In January 1944, inspectors from the International Red Cross visited. They interviewed prisoners, examined kitchens and infirmaries, and reviewed records. Their final report declared the camp compliant with all international standards. For the prisoners, the visit meant something deeper, confirmation that the world still knew they existed. That acknowledgement, more than food or comfort, restored a sense of worth. As the months passed, camp life mirrored the cycle of nature. Gardens flourished, chickens clucked in pens, and fruit trees began to grow. The men, once soldiers, became farmers again. Working the soil reminded them of peace, of families and homes far away. At dusk, the smell of cooking fires drifted through the barracks. Mixing with the salt air of the sea, life had become simple, almost bearable. By May 1944, a strange transformation had taken place. The prisoners no longer thought of themselves solely as captives, nor of the guards as enemies. Mutual respect had replaced hostility. Both sides had come to understand that they were bound together by circumstance, not ideology. For the first time since the war began, the prisoners felt something like peace, not freedom, but the quiet knowledge that human decency could survive even here, behind the fence. By the winter of 1944, the prisoner of war camp had settled into a rhythm so regular it almost resembled normal life. Days passed quietly, marked by work shifts, inspections, and meals. Yet beneath the surface of this ordered existence, there remained one unspoken longing, the desire to reconnect with the world beyond the fence. For months, the prisoners had lived as if cut off from time itself. Then, in February, something unexpected happened: permission to write home. When the news spread through the camp, it felt unreal. The announcement came through the barrack leaders. Each man would be allowed to write one letter, no more than 2 pages, under the supervision of the Red Cross. The messages would be censored and translated, but they would be sent. For many, it was the first direct contact with home since their capture. The moment carried immense weight. It meant that somewhere far away, their families might finally know they were alive. The rules were strict. Prisoners were forbidden to mention military information or describe camp conditions. Only health, personal thoughts, and simple greetings were permitted. The limitation didn't matter. For men who had thought themselves erased from the world, even a few sentences were enough. It wasn't communication they needed, it was recognition, proof of existence. For days, the camp was filled with the sound of pencils scratching against paper. The men wrote carefully, as if the act itself could bridge the vast ocean between captivity and home. Some letters were short, reduced to formal phrases about health and hope. Others were longer, filled with emotion contained in simple words. Many avoided speaking of the war entirely. They wrote instead about the weather, about memories, about their wish to see familiar faces again. When the first bundle of letters was collected by the Red Cross, silence filled the camp. The men watched as the envelopes were sealed and carried away, vanishing beyond the fence. They did not know if they would ever reach their destination. Still, the very act of writing had changed something inside them. For the first time in months, they felt connected to a life that still existed somewhere beyond the horizon. Weeks passed, then months. The letters became a ritual of waiting. Every day, Eyes turned toward the main gate, hoping for news. Finally, in the spring of 1944, it came. A Red Cross courier arrived with a canvas mailbag. Inside were envelopes, real letters, from home. When the names were read aloud in each barrack, men stood frozen, hardly breathing. Some smiled, others wept silently. For a few, no letters came, and their silence was heavier than words. Those who received letters read them again and again until the paper wore thin. They learned that their families were alive, that homes still stood, that somewhere normal life continued. Some read that their towns had been bombed or that relatives were gone. Yet even grief brought comfort. It meant that life, fragile and painful, still went on. The effect on morale was immediate. American officers noted a visible change in behavior. Discipline improved, work was done with new purpose, and quarrels became rare. The camp, once somber and detached, now carried a quiet undercurrent of hope. The letters had given the men something they had lost a reason to endure. From that point forward, correspondence became part of camp life. Once every 2 months, prisoners could send new letters. Paper and pencils were rationed, but everyone made the most of them. Some even crafted envelopes from scrap paper or food wrappers. Each envelope bore stamps of the Red Cross and the censor's marks, but it didn't matter. These small pieces of paper were now bridges to another world. The content of the letters rarely changed. Most men reassured their families that they were healthy and being treated fairly. Few dared to mention fear or despair. They wanted to protect those at home from worry. Their restraint was a form of strength, an attempt to remain soldiers, even without weapons. When letters brought news of loss, the atmosphere in the camp darkened. Several men learned that their families had perished. There were no ceremonies, no condolences, only silence. In those moments, comradeship replaced words. Others shared their rations, a cigarette, or simply sat nearby. In grief, the prisoners found unity. They had all lost something: their freedom, their country, their old selves. Over time, the letters became a chronicle of the camp's inner life. Some prisoners marked each mailing and delivery date in small notebooks. Decades later, historians would use these notes to reconstruct daily life inside wartime prison camps. But in 1944, the prisoners were simply keeping track of hope. The letters also began to change the prisoners' perception of their captors. Before, the guards had been distant figures, embodiments of authority and victory. Now, the prisoners realized that the Americans received letters too. In the evenings, they saw guards sitting quietly, with envelopes in their hands, reading under the lamplight, smiling faintly, or staring into space. That small recognition that both sides waited for words from home became a bridge of understanding more powerful than any speech. Later that year, the Red Cross organized a small exhibition inside one of the barracks. Copies of selected letters, translated and anonymized, were displayed on the walls. They told of longing, fear, and endurance. One message, written in careful script, read, "We thought we had been forgotten, but we were remembered." That means life goes on. That single line captured the essence of what the prisoners had come to feel. By the summer of 1944, mail deliveries had become the heartbeat of the camp. Every new arrival brought anticipation, joy, and sometimes tears. Even those who received nothing shared in the collective emotion. The act of waiting itself was unifying, a reminder that they were all human beings, bound by the same fragile thread of connection. For the men who had entered captivity expecting only pain, these letters represented something greater than freedom. They were proof that humanity could survive even in confinement. Through them, the prisoners rediscovered a sense of belonging to the world. They were no longer forgotten soldiers in a distant war. They were sons, husbands, and fathers once more. By the autumn of 1944, The rhythm of letters had become as natural as sunrise. Writing them was not just communication, it was resistance. Each line declared, "We are alive." Each envelope that crossed the ocean was a small act of defiance against the void, and with every reply that arrived, hope took root a little deeper behind the barbed wire. The autumn of 1944 passed quietly in the camp. The war continued beyond the horizon, but here life followed a slow, predictable rhythm. To the prisoners, the world seemed to have shrunk to a few acres of fenced land bordered by guard towers and the sea. Yet within this confinement, a profound change was taking place, one that would redefine how they saw their captors and themselves. It began with small things. One morning, a tropical storm swept through the island. Rain poured down in thick sheets, soaking everything and everyone. During roll call, both prisoners and guards stood together under the downpour, equally drenched and shivering. At that moment, the invisible wall between them seemed to thin. The prisoners saw the guards not as faceless soldiers, but as men wet, cold, and tired, just like them. War had made enemies of them, but nature reminded them of their shared humanity. The American guards maintained discipline, but avoided cruelty. Their orders were firm, yet their tone rarely harsh. They supervised work details, inspected barracks, and enforced rules, but they did so with professionalism rather than hatred. Some were older men, others barely more than boys. They too were far from home, counting days and letters. Slowly, the prisoners began to see patterns of ordinary life within their captors' routines, gestures, habits, fatigue. They realized that behind the uniforms were individuals shaped by duty, not malice. The camp itself operated according to the Geneva Convention, a concept most of the prisoners had only vaguely heard of. For the first time, they experienced its principles in practice. They were protected from physical punishment, guaranteed medical treatment, and even allowed to practice their language and customs within limits. The fairness of the system puzzled them. The propaganda they had known before capture had painted the enemy as ruthless and barbaric. Now they saw something else: order, restraint, and a strange, impersonal kindness. These observations began to erode old certainties. Some prisoners started keeping private notes, writing down their impressions of camp life and the conduct of the guards. The tone of these entries was cautious, analytical. One described the Americans as machines of discipline but not hatred. Another wrote that he had come to respect their calmness, the quiet of people who do not need to shout to be strong. Such thoughts were dangerous during Beharriks, the war. But in the isolation of the camp, they became a quiet revelation. By the winter of 1944, 1945, the camp existed like a small island of order amid a world collapsing into chaos. The nights were cool, the winds sharp. To keep warm, the guards distributed extra blankets and allowed prisoners to install makeshift stoves. The gestures seemed minor, but to men used to deprivation, they carried weight. For the first time, they felt treated not as captives, but as human beings. As months went by, curiosity replaced fear. The prisoners began to observe the guards closely, listening to their conversations, trying to understand their words. Some started learning English from old manuals found in the camp library. They compiled notebooks with simple translations, commands, greetings, everyday phrases. At first, this was practical, a way to follow orders more easily. But it soon became something deeper, an attempt to understand the minds of those who had defeated them. When one can understand the language of the enemy, that enemy becomes less of a shadow and more of a mirror. Letters continued to arrive from home, and through them, another realization dawned. The guards received letters too. In the evenings, when the day's duties ended, both sides retreated into the same silence, reading by lantern light. The prisoners saw the guards smile faintly at familiar handwriting, fold the paper carefully, and slip it into their pockets. The sight was simple, almost tender. It destroyed the illusion that only one side suffered from distance and loss. In the spring of 1945, the camp was visited by another Red Cross inspection. The report described excellent discipline and a spirit of mutual respect between captors and captives. Behind the bureaucratic phrasing was a deeper truth. Both groups had learned to coexist not just through rules, but through recognition of each other's humanity. Photographs from that time show faces calm, alert, neither proud nor broken. They looked like men suspended between two worlds. Not everyone welcomed this change. A few of the older officers among the prisoners clung to old beliefs. They warned against trust, insisting that any sign of sympathy was weakness. Yet even they could not deny what they saw: daily guards who treated them with fairness, and a camp run on principles rather than vengeance. The boundaries between enemy and fellow human were fading, and even the most rigid minds could not ignore it. As spring turned to summer, a new tradition began: organized sports. The camp command decided to hold a football match to boost morale. Separate teams were formed: prisoners on one side, guards on the other. It was meant as recreation, nothing more. But on that warm afternoon, when the ball rolled across the field and laughter broke out from both sides, the meaning went beyond sport. For a brief moment, war disappeared. There were no uniforms, no sides, only men playing a game under the same sun. This event became symbolic. American officers noted in their logs that the match improved relations and demonstrated the psychological benefit of organized recreation. But for those who played, it represented something simpler: proof that decency could survive even in captivity. The cheering that day was not for victory, but for the rediscovery of normal human connection. By mid-1945, news of the war's approaching end reached the camp. Radios carried fragmented reports: cities burning, armies collapsing, peace negotiations. The prisoners felt the shift long before any official announcement. The guards grew quieter, their faces more serious. Everyone understood that something immense was coming. The atmosphere was heavy with expectation. For months, the men had lived in suspended animation, and now time was catching up. They spoke little of what awaited them. Some dreamed of home, others feared disgrace. For most, the question was not whether they would survive, but what they would be when it was over. As summer deepened, a kind of calm settled over the camp. The hostility that had defined their early days in captivity was gone. In its place remained a subdued respect, fragile but real. The prisoners no longer spoke of vengeance or hatred. The guards no longer viewed them as potential threats. The barbed wire remained, but it had lost its sting. For both sides, this strange coexistence had changed something fundamental. The prisoners had entered the camp expecting cruelty and found order instead. The guards had expected defiance and found dignity. They had become, in a sense, reflections of each other, proof that the enemy's humanity mirrors one's own. When historians later studied the records of this camp, they noted that almost no violence had been recorded there, no executions, no riots. What they found instead was an atmosphere of weary civility, a small island of restraint in a war that often knew none. In the end, the prisoners understood something their years of training had never taught them. War is fought not only with weapons, but with choices. And in that remote camp, surrounded by wire and sea, they discovered that mercy could exist even in the heart of conflict. The summer of 1945 began with rumors. Across the camp, whispers spread of approaching peace, of cities falling, of a world slowly collapsing under the weight of exhaustion. The prisoners listened to the fragments of radio broadcasts that drifted in through the guards' quarters, trying to decipher truth from speculation. Something was changing, though no one knew exactly what. The American administration grew more vigilant, Security was tightened, inspections more frequent. The guards, once relaxed, now seemed preoccupied, their usual composure replaced by quiet tension. The prisoners could feel it too. After years of stillness, the air felt charged with uncertainty. They understood that the war was drawing to a close, but what that meant for them, freedom or something else, no one could say. By late July, the tropical heat was suffocating. The days passed slowly under the relentless sun, while the nights were restless and filled with strange silence. Then came the first vague reports of a new weapon, something so powerful that it could destroy entire cities. The prisoners didn't understand what it meant, and the guards avoided talking about it. A few days later, on a humid morning, the news arrived officially. Hostilities had ceased. Their homeland had surrendered. The announcement was read out on the parade ground. The prisoners stood in formation, motionless, as the words were translated. The war is over. For a long moment, no one spoke or moved. The statement, though simple, seemed impossible to grasp. For years, they had lived suspended between fear and duty, sustained by the idea that their suffering had purpose. Now, that purpose had vanished. Reactions varied. Some men lowered their heads, unable to meet each other's eyes. Others stared blankly at the ground. A few wept quietly, not from joy, but from the unbearable realization that everything they had fought for was gone. The guards, too, seemed shaken. They had fought for victory, and yet, faced with the sight of defeated men, there was no triumph in their faces, only weariness. That evening, the camp fell silent. The only sounds were the waves and the faint hum of insects. No orders were shouted, no patrols marched. For the first time, the prisoners were left to themselves. Some sat on their bunks for hours, staring into the darkness. Others prayed or wrote brief notes in their journals. Many simply lay awake, trying to imagine what home would look like after years of absence. In the following days, the camp's routine began to change. The roll calls continued, but more out of habit than necessity. The fences still stood, but their meaning had shifted. The guards were no longer jailers, they were caretakers, waiting for instructions from higher command. The Red Cross arrived more frequently, bringing documents, medicine, and news. The word repatriation began to circulate, though few understood when or how it would happen. Paperwork dominated the weeks that followed. Names were checked, lists verified, medical forms filled out. Each man's identity had to be confirmed, every record matched. Some of the prisoners grew impatient, others indifferent. After years of captivity, waiting had become second nature. Food rations improved. Fresh vegetables, meat, and fruit began to appear in the camp kitchens. The Americans explained that humanitarian aid shipments had increased. The prisoners ate in silence, their thoughts far from the tables. They were alive, but their hearts were elsewhere, with families they had not seen in years, with cities they feared no longer existed. As the days passed, more news filtered in. Photographs of ruined cities began circulating. Collapsed bridges, burned streets, entire neighborhoods reduced to ash. For the prisoners, it was a second shock. They realized that the country to which they would soon return was not the one they had left. The homeland of their memory had ceased to exist. In September, representatives of the Red Cross arrived once more. They held brief interviews with groups of prisoners, recording their names and conditions. The official report described morale as stable, calm, resigned. But behind those words lay something deeper. The quiet disorientation of men who no longer knew who they were without the war. Repatriation began slowly. Medical teams examined the prisoners, issuing certificates of health. Transport lists were posted on the notice boards. Some names appeared, others did not. When the first ship arrived, anchored just beyond the shore, the men watched it in silence. It looked both familiar and foreign. a vessel not of war, but of return. The departure was solemn. The prisoners lined up at the gate, carrying small bundles of belongings, letters, notebooks, and a few personal items allowed by the guards. As they stepped forward, they did not cheer. Many paused briefly, looking back at the camp, the wooden barracks, the watchtowers, the fences that had confined them for years. What had once been a place of fear had become something else, a fragment of life, a place of strange humanity. When the ship's engines finally started, the men crowded the deck in silence. The island slowly receded into the distance. The sea stretched endlessly ahead, calm and indifferent. The prisoners were returning home, but to what kind of home? They could not imagine. Some felt hope, others only emptiness. Many feared what awaited them, the judgment of their own people, the burden of survival. In the records of the American administration, that camp was later listed as closed due to repatriation. The final entry, dated October 1945, reads simply, "All prisoners departed in good health." It was a bureaucratic phrase, devoid of emotion. But for those who had lived behind the fence, it marked the end of an era. For the prisoners, the end of the war did not feel like liberation. It felt like waking from a long, disorienting dream. They were free, yet uncertain. The war had ended, but its echo still filled their minds. As the coastline of their homeland appeared on the horizon, they stood quietly on the deck, each man alone with his thoughts. They had expected death and found survival. They had expected hatred and found order. Now, they faced the hardest task of all, returning to a world that no longer existed. By late autumn of 1945, the long process of repatriation finally began. Groups of former prisoners boarded transport ships bound for home. The departures were quiet, almost solemn. There were no speeches, no celebrations. The journey was not just across the ocean, it was across time. From the world of war to the uncertain peace that waited beyond. The ships were slow, their decks crowded with men who had spent years behind fences. The accommodations were basic wooden bunks stacked 3 high, metal trays for food, and small portholes through which the horizon seemed endless. The voyage lasted weeks. Each sunrise and sunset blended into the next, the sea stretching vast and indifferent. For many, the steady hum of the engines became a lullaby, marking the slow return to a life they barely remembered. The men had dreamed of home for years, but as the coastline grew closer, fear began to surface alongside hope. They knew their country had changed. Rumors of devastation had reached them, cities reduced to rubble, families scattered, shortages everywhere. The home they imagined might no longer exist. And deeper still was another fear, one harder to name. How would they be received? For many cultures, captivity carried a heavy stigma. To have surrendered was to have failed. This unspoken shame weighed on every heart aboard those ships. When the first transports docked at the ports, officials and medical teams awaited them. There were no flags or parades, only silence and the smell of disinfectant. Each man was registered, examined, and photographed. Uniforms were exchanged for civilian clothes. The process was efficient, but cold. They were welcomed not as heroes, but as statistics, as survivors who carried both relief and unease. The returning men were sent to temporary processing centers. There, they received food, clothing, and documents. For many, it was their first experience of civilian life in years. But freedom felt disorienting. The habits of captivity lingered. Some woke automatically at dawn, waiting for roll call that never came. Others lined up silently in the cafeteria as if still obeying camp routines. The body remembered discipline, even when the mind longed for freedom. Outside the centers, the world was unrecognizable. Cities lay in ruins, streets littered with debris, people living in makeshift shelters. Families searched for one another among the ruins, using scraps of paper pinned to boards listing the missing. For those who had survived in captivity, the destruction was difficult to comprehend. They had been spared the direct horrors of bombing, yet returning to a homeland reduced to ashes brought a different kind of pain. Many had nowhere to go. Their homes were gone, their families scattered or dead. The government established repatriate programs, offering small stipends and temporary housing, but resources were scarce. Jobs were few. Some men drifted from city to city, searching for relatives or work. Others joined reconstruction projects, helping to rebuild railways, bridges, and ports. For them, labor became a form of therapy, a way to regain purpose and dignity. Social attitudes were another obstacle. In a nation still struggling to redefine itself after defeat, returning prisoners faced suspicion. To have been captured was seen by some as dishonor, even betrayal. Many avoided speaking of their experiences, hiding their identity as former prisoners. They burned their camp papers and journals, burying the past to avoid shame. Silence became their shield. Medical and psychological reports from the time reveal a generation marked by invisible wounds. Many suffered from insomnia, anxiety, or sudden fits of rage. Some withdrew completely, unable to reconcile the world they remembered with the one they had found. Others turned their pain inward, living quietly, devoting themselves to rebuilding rather than remembering. Yet through this struggle, there was resilience. The same endurance that had carried them through captivity now helped them rebuild. By 1946, life was beginning to move forward. Reconstruction projects filled the cities with noise, hammers, saws, engines. The men who had once lived behind barbed wire now mixed concrete, repaired rail lines, and cleared rubble. Their discipline and cooperation, forged in the camp, proved invaluable. Some found solace in work, others in family. Slowly, imperceptibly, life returned to the ruins. Still, not everyone could adapt. There were those who vanished into the countryside, unable to reintegrate. Some emigrated, seeking anonymity abroad. A few even remained in the lands where they had been imprisoned, marrying, working, and building new lives. But the majority stayed. They carried the past within them quietly, privately, as they helped rebuild the nation that had once abandoned them. Official programs for former prisoners began in the late 1942. Doctors offered medical examinations, and the government issued identification papers recognizing their service and imprisonment. The assistance was modest, symbolic, rather than substantial, but it represented a shift in perception. Slowly, society began to understand that survival itself could be an act of courage. In the years that followed, the stigma of captivity began to fade. The sheer scale of loss across the nation made judgment seem meaningless. Everyone had suffered in some form. The returning soldiers became part of a shared story of endurance, yet few ever spoke openly of their time in the camps. To their families, they offered only fragments that they had been treated decently, that they had survived, that it was long ago. For most, the silence remained permanent. Historians later noted that adaptation to peace was, for many, harder than captivity itself. In the camp, life had been governed by rules and routine. Outside, freedom demanded choices, responsibilities, and uncertainty. The men had to rediscover how to live as individuals after years of collective existence. This process was slow and painful. But it was through this struggle that they found meaning again. By 1946, the last transport ships had returned. The camps overseas were dismantled, their fences torn down, their barracks left to rot. Photographs show empty wooden structures slowly reclaimed by grass and salt air. The war had ended, but its memory lingered in every survivor's face in the way they walked, spoke, and paused before answering questions. In time, the former prisoners became indistinguishable from other veterans. They built homes, raised families, and contributed quietly to society. They rarely joined veterans associations or parades. Their experience was too different, too personal. But within that silence lay an unspoken pride, not in victory, but in endurance. Those who had lived behind the wire understood something profound, that dignity was not given by rank or victory, but earned through the refusal to lose one's humanity. Many of them carried that lesson into their later lives, teaching their children not to hate, but to endure, to rebuild, to remember. When historians look back on their generation, they often describe it as one defined by restraint, men who had seen the worst and chosen, afterward, to be silent. Yet within that silence was strength. Theirs was a generation that rebuilt not only cities, but the idea of humanity itself. By the spring of 1946, the last remaining prisoners returned home. Their former camp was abandoned, the gates open, the wind carrying away the last traces of voices and footsteps. What remained was memory invisible, enduring, like the sound of the sea that had surrounded them for so long. For those who returned, life did not begin anew, it simply continued. They never forgot the paradox of their captivity, that in the place where they had expected torment, they had discovered a fragment of peace. And perhaps that was the quietest, most profound victory of all. Years passed after the end of the war. The world rebuilt itself, cities rose from the ashes, and people tried to forget the pain that had defined their generation. Yet for those who had survived captivity, time did not flow as easily. Their memories lingered quiet, persistent, and deeply personal. For many, the years in the camp had not ended when the gates opened. They carried the experience within them like an invisible wound. In the first decade after the war, silence surrounded the subject of captivity. Nations celebrated victories and mourned the dead, but little was said about those who had been taken prisoner. In some places, returning soldiers were treated with suspicion, as if survival itself were something shameful. The veterans who had been prisoners learned quickly to hide their past. They did not speak of the fences, the roll calls, or the strange humanity they had found among their captors. They locked those years away, afraid that no one would understand. For a long time, memory survived only in fragments, in hidden diaries, in letters folded into books, in the rare conversations whispered between those who had shared the same fate. Sometimes, an old comrade would visit, and for a few hours, the silence would lift. They would sit together, drinking tea, speaking of the weather, of work, and then carefully of the camp. But only briefly. The memories were too heavy, too complex to share fully. Society preferred to move on. The 1,950 seconds brought recovery and progress, and with them, a desire to forget. Factories reopened, cities were rebuilt, and the new generation grew up in peace. Yet forgetting is never complete. Beneath the surface of prosperity, the past waited quiet, unresolved. It would take years before anyone would dare to confront it openly. The change began in the late 1950 seconds, when historians and journalists started to collect testimonies from veterans. The world had entered an age of reflection. Scholars sought to understand how war had shaped the human soul. The stories of prisoners long ignored suddenly became important. At first, the survivors resisted. They distrusted outsiders, fearing that their experiences would be twisted or misunderstood. But as they grew older, some began to talk. They realized that if they remained silent, their story would vanish with them. The first articles appeared in local newspapers, small pieces about life in distant camps, about unexpected kindness, about the fragile balance between fear and compassion. The tone of these stories was not heroic. They spoke of endurance, of dignity, and of the moments when humanity survived amid chaos. Readers were surprised. For many, it was the first time they heard that not all captivity was marked by cruelty, that sometimes, even in war, men could treat each other as equals. By the early 1960s, researchers were organizing interviews and collecting documents. Museums began displaying small exhibitions dedicated to prisoners of war. On the walls hung faded photographs, letters, and official Red Cross reports. Visitors read the words written decades earlier, words of longing and patience. "We are alive. Do not worry. One day we will return." The simplicity of those lines moved people more than any monument could. Former prisoners began to gather again. Quietly at first. They met in community halls and small cafes, bringing old photos and letters. They looked at one another with the recognition of those who shared something no one else could understand. There were no uniforms, no ceremonies, only quiet talk and long silences. They spoke not to relive the past, but to confirm that it had truly happened. Historians soon realized that these recollections were invaluable. The survivors possessed details no archive could provide: the sounds, the smells, the rhythm of life behind the wire. Many offered their notebooks, lists, and sketches to museums. Others wrote memoirs, spare and unadorned, in which they described not heroism, but simple endurance. Their words lacked bitterness. Instead, they carried a tone of calm reflection, as if the experience had taught them something about the essence of being human. By the 1970s, society's attitude had changed. The once silent topic of captivity became part of the broader history of the war. Governments began to recognize former prisoners officially, issuing certificates and modest pensions. Commemorative plaques appeared on memorials and monuments. On them were engraved not only the names of those who died, but also those who returned. The shame had faded. In its place remained respect. Documentary filmmakers joined historians in preserving these stories. They filmed interviews with aging survivors, recorded their recollections, and combined them with historical footage. In one documentary, an old man described the moment when an American guard handed him a cigarette after years of fighting. "It was then," he said, "that I realized war had ended for me, not outside, but inside." Such moments revealed truths that statistics could not capture. Gradually, the story of captivity became not just a personal memory, but part of collective consciousness. Schools included it in history lessons, and students read excerpts from the prisoners' letters and diaries. The next generation, raised in peace, saw these stories not as tales of defeat, but as lessons in humanity. The idea that the enemy could be human too began to shape how people understood war itself. Through the 1980 seconds and 1990 seconds, reunions continued. Though the faces grew older, the gatherings smaller. At each meeting, there were fewer men than before. Yet those who came still shared the same quiet bond, a mixture of sadness and gratitude. They spoke of how the years in captivity had changed them, how they had learned patience, restraint, and respect for life. Many said those lessons had guided them more than any victory could have. Museums began to expand their exhibitions, creating permanent sections about the lives of prisoners of war. One exhibit recreated a barrack wooden bunks, metal cups, a single lamp. Visitors could read the letters on the walls, translated into several languages. The messages spoke not of politics or ideology, but of endurance, hope, and the will to live. "We thought we were forgotten," read one display, "but we were remembered, and that means life continues." By the turn of the century, these memories had become part of global history. Scholars cited them in studies of humanitarian law, ethics, and post-war reconciliation. The example of humane treatment in wartime camps influenced international conventions and education programs. The men who had once been prisoners became symbols not of weakness, but of moral strength, proof that dignity can survive even in captivity. For the survivors themselves, these final decades brought a quiet peace. They knew that their stories would not be lost. Their diaries, photographs, and voices were now preserved in archives, museums, and films. When they were invited to speak to students or at commemorations, they did so without bitterness. They spoke calmly, often ending with the same thought, that mercy is stronger than hatred. As the years went on, their numbers dwindled, yet their memory endured in books, in museums, in the minds of their children and grandchildren. For them, the story of the camps was not about defeat or shame, but about the persistence of humanity in impossible conditions. When the last of them passed away, their words remained. In many museums, a single quote now stands as a quiet testament. We survived. We saw the enemy's humanity, and that was enough. Through their experience, the world learned something essential, that even in war, compassion can exist, that decency can outlast destruction, that memory itself is a form of victory. Decades passed. The world that had once burned in war now lived in peace, its nations bound together by trade, memory, and uneasy cooperation. The survivors of that time grew old, their faces lined by years, but calm with understanding. The events that had defined their youth had faded into history, yet their echoes remained, carried forward by stories, photographs, and the quiet persistence of memory. The camp where they had once lived no longer existed. Its wooden barracks had long been dismantled, its fences rusted away. In their place stood a small memorial, built by local historians and volunteers. At its center was a stone engraved with a simple inscription. Here, enemies shared the same sun and the same sky. The phrase had been chosen by the former prisoners themselves. It captured not just a moment in time, but the lesson they wanted to leave behind, that humanity, once found, cannot be forgotten. Each year, on the anniversary of the war's end, people gathered at the site. Historians, diplomats, and descendants came to pay their respects. They brought flowers and photographs, reading aloud the names of those who had once lived there. Among the visitors were veterans from both sides, gray-haired men who no longer saw each other as enemies. They stood side by side, their silence more powerful than any speech. Between them stretched not hostility, but understanding. Over time, the story of the camp became more than a local memory. Researchers from different countries studied its history, comparing it to others across the world. They examined records, Red Cross reports, and diaries to understand how a place built for captivity had become a small example of humanity in war. At international conferences, the camp was cited as evidence that even during global conflict, moral law could survive. It was mentioned alongside the Geneva Conventions, not as an ideal, but as proof that decency could exist in practice. This recognition grew into something larger. Universities introduced courses on humanitarian conduct during wartime, using the camp as a case study. Students learned that it was not merely a question of law, but of conscience, that the choices of a few guards, doctors, administrators could shape the fate and dignity of hundreds. The story became a reminder that humanity does not vanish in war. It must be chosen, again and again. The influence extended beyond academia. In the 1,970 seconds and 1,980 seconds, writers, artists, and filmmakers began to draw inspiration from the camp's history. Novels and films appeared, not about heroism or battle, but about recognition, the moment when a man sees his enemy as a mirror. These works reached wide audiences, reshaping how people thought about the war. They reminded viewers that compassion and discipline could coexist with strength, and that mercy was not weakness but wisdom. In the following decades, international meetings of former combatants became more common. Veterans from both sides met not to relive the past, but to reconcile with it. They exchanged memories, visited sites of former camps, and sometimes even planted trees together. Such acts simple as they were, held profound meaning. Each was a quiet declaration that history's wounds could heal without forgetting. During the 1,990 seconds, historians began to explore how humane treatment of prisoners had influenced post-war diplomacy. They discovered that the respect shown in certain camps had quietly shaped the first contacts between nations after peace was signed. It built a fragile foundation of trust, one that would later grow into cooperation. Acts of mercy, once seen as small and isolated, had rippled through time, leaving lasting consequences in politics as well as in hearts. For the descendants of the former prisoners, the story became a legacy. Many learned about it not from their fathers directly, who often remained silent, but from letters found in drawers, notebooks hidden in boxes, or newspaper clippings preserved in family albums. These discoveries inspired a new generation to ask questions, to travel, to learn. Some wrote books, others made documentaries. They turned their ancestors' silence into testimony. In schools, the story of the camp became part of lessons on history and ethics. Teachers spoke not of blame, but of choice, of how men trapped by war still managed to remain human. Students read excerpts from diaries, where the language was simple yet profound. They expected us to hate them. We did not. Such lines, spoken decades later, carried the weight of lived truth. In the early 2000s, under the guidance of the United Nations, an international exhibition opened dedicated to humanitarianism in wartime. Among the many displays stood a section about the Pacific camp. Visitors saw photographs of prisoners smiling faintly at a football match, doctors tending to the sick, guards and captives sharing cigarettes under the sun. The caption beneath read, "They expected torture, but found decency instead." It was a short sentence, but it said everything. The memory of those years continued to evolve. For younger generations, born long after the war, these stories seemed almost impossible, a time when enemies treated each other with respect amidst destruction. Yet that very contrast made the lessons more powerful. It reminded them that morality is not determined by circumstances, but by decisions. In the final years of the survivors' lives, interviews were recorded for archives and museums. Their voices, slow and deliberate, spoke without bitterness. They described their captors not as saints, but as men who followed rules and through that discipline, preserved dignity on both sides. "We were enemies," one said, "but we learned to be human again." Their words, spoken softly into microphones, became part of the world's collective memory. When the last of them passed away, newspapers published brief obituaries. The lines were simple. "He survived the war and captivity and never forgot compassion." To most readers, it was just a story among many. But for those who understood, it marked the closing of an era, the passing of the last witnesses to a truth that history sometimes overlooks, that mercy is as real as cruelty. Today, the site of the camp is a place of learning. School groups visit the memorial, listening as guides tell the story. They walk among the foundations where barracks once stood, now covered with grass and wildflowers. In the breeze, the sound of rustling leaves mingles with distant waves. The place feels peaceful, not haunted, but calm. Those who come there sense that something sacred endures, not in monuments, but in memory itself. Every war leaves its echoes. Most are filled with pain, anger, and grief. But some rare and precious carry quieter tones of understanding, restraint, and compassion. The story of the prisoners who expected torture but found decency belongs to this second kind. It reminds us that even in humanity's darkest hours, light can survive in the smallest acts, in a shared meal, a tended wound, a letter safely delivered. And so the echo continues. It lives in the voices of teachers, in the pages of history books, in the silent respect of those who stand before the memorial stone. It whispers the same message across generations, that the measure of civilization is not found in victory, but in how we treat the defeated. The fences are gone. The watchtowers vanished. Only the sky remains the same sky that once watched over both captor and captive, over fear and forgiveness. And beneath that sky, the echo endures, carrying forward the simple truth that even in war, humanity can prevail.